At a family dinner, I accidentally bumped into my sister. She slapped me in front of everyone. "Are you blind?" she yelled. My mother said, "Apologize or get out of here." I held my burning cheek, looked at them, and walked out. December 21st. At 8 in the morning, I left a package at their door. What they found inside made the whole family scream in panic. The sharp sound of flesh meeting flesh echoed through the massive dining room of my parents' 10,000 square foot Atlanta estate. My head snapped to the side. The stinging heat on my left cheek was instantaneous. I stood frozen on the imported Persian rug, holding an empty gravy boat. A single drop of cranberry sauce was currently soaking into the carpet, having narrowly missed the toe of my sister Vanessa's pristine white shoe. "Are you completely blind?" Vanessa screamed. Her voice vibrated with a pitch that made the crystal wine glasses rattle on the long mahogany table. "These are $2,000 custom shoes. That is more than you make in an entire month running your little freelance errands." I slowly turned my face back to look at her. Vanessa, at 35 years old, was the absolute pride of the local elite community. She was a high-profile dermatologist currently shaking with a rage that seemed entirely disproportionate to a drop of spilled sauce. All eyes were locked on me, the family disappointment, wearing a simple beige blazer that I knew they all assumed I bought on clearance. My mother Vivica rushed over from the head of the table. She did not check my face. She did not ask if I was all right. Instead, she shoved a linen napkin into Vanessa's hands, casting a look of pure disgust in my direction. "Nadine, apologize to your sister right now or get out of my house," my mother yelled. Her voice trembled with that familiar mix of embarrassment and fury she always reserved for me. "Vanessa just paid $250,000 for our church community center renovation, and you come here looking like a vagrant and try to ruin her night. You have been jealous of her ever since she got into medical school, while you dropped out of law school to drive delivery trucks." I took a slow breath, tasting a faint hint of copper where my teeth had caught the inside of my lip. Before I could formulate a response, my brother-in-law Julian stepped forward. Julian was a 37-year-old white wealth manager who had married into our family 5 years ago and immediately positioned himself as our financial savior. He wrapped a protective arm around Vanessa's waist and glared down at me with absolute contempt. "Do not be too hard on her, Vivica," Julian said. His voice dripped with unbearable condescension. "People who live in cheap rented apartments simply do not know how to conduct themselves in a multi-million-dollar home. It is a class issue, really. Nadine simply lacks the refinement required for this level of society." My father Desmond marched over to join the firing squad. He pointed a trembling finger toward the massive oak front doors. "I should have never let you come tonight, Nadine. You are a constant stain on this family reputation. Look at Julian. He is fixing my entire retirement portfolio, building our legacy, securing our wealth, while you cannot even walk across a room without causing a disaster. Get your coat and leave. Do not come back until you learn how to respect the successful people in this family." I stood there surrounded by the four of them. For 8 years, I had let them believe I was a struggling freelancer who did menial logistics work. They needed me to be the failure so they could feel exceptional. They needed a scapegoat to make their golden child shine brighter. But what they did not know was that my little logistics work was actually my role as the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar private equity and commercial real estate firm. I owned a penthouse downtown, and my company owned the very land their beloved country club sat on. I did not cry. I did not yell back. I wiped a small smudge of lipstick from the corner of my mouth. I looked at my mother, whose face was twisted in anger, then at my father, who looked at me like I was trash. Finally, my eyes locked directly onto Julian. His smug, arrogant smile was plastered across his face as he held his complaining wife. I slowly tilted my head, letting a very cold smile spread across my lips. "Are you completely sure it was Vanessa's money that paid for the church community center, Julian?" I asked. My voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried perfectly through the dead, silent room. The smugness vanished from Julian's face in an absolute instant. His jaw went slack, and the heavy silver fork he had been holding clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and terrified. He knew exactly what I meant. He knew about the millions of dollars in illicit debt he was hiding, and in that split second he realized I might know about it too. Vanessa looked confused, turning quickly to her husband. "Julian, what is she talking about?" Vanessa demanded. I did not wait around for him to formulate a pathetic little lie. I calmly adjusted my simple beige blazer, picked up my leather purse from the entryway table, and walked out the heavy oak front doors into the crisp Atlanta night. The deep satisfaction of the absolute terror I saw in Julian's eyes was the only warmth I needed. As I walked slowly down the long manicured driveway toward my car, I knew the game had finally changed. They wanted to treat me like a poor peasant, but they were about to find out I was the one holding the deed to their entire kingdom. Sitting in the driver's seat of my car, I watched my phone screen light up. The family group chat was already a war zone. My father sent a long message telling me I was a disgrace, and that I was officially cut off from the family. I did not shed a single tear. I dialed the number for my chief operating officer. The phone rang exactly once before he answered. "Execute Operation December," I said, staring at the massive glowing windows of my parents' house. "Buy the debt, all of it." A new message popped up on my screen. It was a private text from Julian. "Stay away from my wife," he wrote. "I am managing this family wealth, and you are just a bitter spinster. You are cut off." I smiled and selected a single photo from my secure files. It was a screenshot of Julian's offshore bank account showing a negative balance of $4 million. I hit send. The typing bubble from Julian appeared, then stopped, then appeared again, then vanished completely. The panic had officially begun. I drove away from the estate, feeling a sense of absolute clarity. The vibrating silence of my phone told me everything I needed to know about Julian's state of mind. He was paralyzed. For years, he had played the role of the white knight in my family, managing their assets, and patting me on the head like a slow child. Now he knew I had the documents to put him in federal prison. I pulled my car onto the highway and headed straight for the city center. My family always assumed I lived in some cramped studio apartment above a noisy laundromat. They never bothered to visit me, so I never bothered to correct them. The truth was, my car glided into the private underground garage of the Apex Holdings Tower. A dedicated express elevator whisked me up 50 floors to my penthouse. I stepped out into a sprawling sanctuary of floor-to-ceiling glass, imported marble, and quiet luxury. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and looked out over the glittering skyline. Much of the commercial real estate I was looking at belonged to my company. 3 days passed since the disastrous dinner. My mother sent exactly 14 emails demanding I reimburse Vanessa for the emotional distress of the evening and pay for a professional deep cleaning of the dining room rug. My father left a single voicemail reiterating that I was a bitter spinster who would never amount to anything. Julian remained completely silent. His silence was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. On the morning of the third day, I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing acquisition contracts, when my chief operating officer forwarded me a link. It was a live video broadcast from Vanessa's public profile. I tapped the screen, and there was my sister. She was standing in the middle of a massive, brightly lit commercial space, wearing a designer hard hat over her flawless hair. She was holding her phone up and spinning around to show her thousands of followers the construction progress of her new luxury dermatology clinic. "Welcome to my dream come true," Vanessa crooned to the camera. She walked past workers installing Italian marble countertops and custom lighting fixtures. "I just want to say how blessed I am to have a husband like Julian who believes in me so much that he personally financed this $5 million facility." She paused to flip her hair and gaze earnestly into the lens. "You know, sometimes you have to cut off toxic, jealous family members to protect your peace. Some people will never understand your success because they are too busy wallowing in their own failures. But we are rising above it. The grand opening is on Christmas Eve, and even the mayor is cutting the ribbon." I took a slow sip of my coffee and watched her gloat. She was completely oblivious to the reality of her situation. She was bragging about Julian's brilliant financial support without realizing that Julian had not used his own money. He had stolen it. Furthermore, she had no idea who actually owned the ground she was standing on. The building she was leasing belonged to a shell corporation called Horizon Properties. Horizon Properties had been quietly acquired by my firm Apex Holdings 2 weeks ago. I was her landlord, and she was currently 3 months behind on her rent. Later that afternoon, I walked down the glass staircase from my penthouse directly into the executive boardroom of my firm. The room smelled of expensive leather and polished wood. My legal team was already waiting for me. Marcus, my head attorney, stood up and slid a thick, heavy manila envelope across the long conference table. "The paperwork is complete," Marcus said quietly. "We have traced every single dollar Julian moved over the past 3 years." I opened the envelope and spread the documents across the table. It was a masterpiece of financial ruin. Julian had completely drained my parents' retirement accounts to fund his own failing stock bets. When he ran out of their cash, he quietly took out a massive second mortgage on their 10,000 square foot estate, forging my father's signature on the federal bank documents. He funneled that illicit money directly into Vanessa's vanity clinic project and her designer wardrobe. He was moving millions of dollars in a desperate shell game to keep up the appearance of extreme wealth. "This package contains the official foreclosure notice from the bank," Marcus explained, pointing to the top document, "along with the proof of the forged signatures and the zero balance statements from your parents' retirement portfolios. We also included the commercial eviction notice for your sister's clinic for non-payment of rent." I touched the crisp paper, feeling the heavy weight of the destruction it carried. My parents had worshipped Julian because he fit their image of success. They had elevated Vanessa because she played the part of the perfect golden child. They had cast me aside because my quiet hard work did not give them anything to brag about at their country club. Now their entire fake empire was sitting in a manila envelope under my hands. I thanked Marcus and took the package back upstairs. The morning of December 21st arrived with a bitter, biting chill in the air. The sky was the color of bruised iron as I woke up at dawn. Today was the day the illusion would shatter. I dressed in a heavy wool coat and took the elevator down to the garage. I bypassed my usual daily driver and chose the black Maybach for this particular errand. I wanted to be comfortable while delivering their reality check. The drive to the suburbs was quiet and smooth. At exactly 8 in the morning, I turned onto the familiar winding street of my parents' exclusive gated neighborhood. I parked the car just outside their massive wrought iron gates. The neighborhood was dead silent, except for the faint sound of wind rustling through the bare oak trees. I stepped out of the car holding the thick manila envelope tightly against my side. I walked up the long, sweeping driveway, my boots making soft crunching sounds on the frosted pavement. The house looked like a fortress of arrogance with its towering columns and perfectly manicured winter landscaping. I climbed the wide stone steps to the grand front porch. I placed the package directly in the center of their pristine welcome mat. I made sure the bold red lettering of the foreclosure notice was slightly visible through the clear window of the envelope. I reached out and firmly pressed the illuminated doorbell. I heard the deep melodic chime echo deep inside the cavernous house. I did not wait to see who would answer. I turned around, walked quickly down the steps, and made my way back to my car. I slid into the luxurious leather seat, closed the heavy door, and started the engine. I put the car in drive and began to pull away slowly. As my car reached the end of the street and turned the corner onto the main road, the crisp morning silence was suddenly and violently broken. A piercing, hysterical scream echoed all the way down the block. It was my mother. The sound was raw and full of absolute terror. The house of cards had finally collapsed. 3 days passed in absolute silence. Julian had not sent a single message since seeing the screenshot of his empty offshore account. My father had not called to demand another apology, and my mother had not texted to complain about the gravy stain on her imported rug. They were likely sitting in their massive house, assuming I was crying in my imaginary cheap apartment, devastated by their rejection. They thought their silence was a punishment. They had no idea it was simply the quiet before the storm. My sister Vanessa, however, could never endure silence for long. She needed a constant audience to validate her existence. On Tuesday afternoon, I sat at the massive oak desk in my penthouse office, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. My tablet was propped up on my desk, playing Vanessa's latest live video. She was walking through the cavernous space of her unfinished dermatology clinic, wearing a tailored white coat and a designer hard hat that rested perfectly over her blowout. The walls behind her were freshly painted, a stark, clinical white, and workers were busy installing custom Italian marble countertops in the background. She flipped her hair and gazed earnestly into the camera lens, reading the flattering comments from her thousands of followers. "You know, guys," she said, her voice dripping with fake empathy. "Sometimes the hardest thing about success is dealing with jealous relatives. People who refuse to put in the work will always try to drag you down to their level. But you just have to protect your peace. I am so incredibly blessed to have a husband who provides for me and parents who truly support my vision." She spun the camera around to show a massive crystal chandelier still wrapped in protective plastic hanging from the vaulted ceiling. "We are opening on Christmas Eve," she squealed, "and the mayor is coming to cut the ribbon. It is going to be the event of the year." I took a slow sip of my black coffee and watched her gloat. She was completely oblivious to the reality of her situation. She was bragging about Julian's brilliant financial support without realizing that Julian had not used his own money. He had stolen it. Furthermore, she had absolutely no idea who actually owned the ground she was currently standing on. The building she was leasing belonged to a commercial real estate entity called Horizon Properties. Horizon Properties had been quietly acquired by my firm Apex Holdings nearly 6 months ago. I was her landlord and she was currently 3 months behind on her rent. I closed the video and let the screen go black. The contrast between her delusion and my reality was staggering. My office occupied the entire top floor of the Apex Tower. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the financial empire I had quietly assembled while my family thought I was a failure. My legal director, Marcus, walked through the heavy glass doors of my office. He did not say a word at first. He simply walked over to my desk and placed a thick, heavy manila envelope right in the center of my leather blotter. "The trap is ready," Marcus said quietly, taking a seat across from me. "We pulled every financial record, every forged document, and every missed payment. It is all in there." I opened the envelope and spread the documents across the polished wood of my desk. It was a masterpiece of absolute financial ruin. Julian had completely drained my parents' retirement accounts to fund his own failing stock bets and maintain his image as a wealthy savior. When he ran out of their cash, he quietly took out a massive second mortgage on their 10,000 square foot estate, forging my father's signature on the federal bank documents. He funneled that illicit money directly into Vanessa's vanity clinic project and her designer wardrobe. He was moving millions of dollars in a desperate shell game to keep up the appearance of extreme wealth, and the game was finally over. The package contained the official foreclosure notice from the bank printed in bold, unyielding letters. Behind it sat the proof of the forged signatures, the zero-balance statements from my parents' once massive retirement portfolios, and the undeniable paper trail of Julian's embezzlement. Tucked right at the very back was the formal commercial eviction notice for Vanessa's luxury clinic. Julian had stopped paying her rent 3 months ago to cover his tracks, and legally I had every right to lock the doors and seize the property. I ran my fingers over the rough paper of the envelope, feeling the heavy weight of the destruction it carried. My parents had worshipped Julian because he fit their perfect image of success. They had elevated Vanessa because she played the part of the flawless golden child. They had cast me aside because my quiet hard work did not give them anything to brag about at their exclusive country club. Now their entire fake empire was sitting in a manila envelope under my hands. I thanked Marcus and placed the papers back inside, sealing the flap tightly. Thursday morning arrived with a bitter, biting winter chill. The sky was a pale, unforgiving gray as I stepped out of my building and into the waiting warmth of my car. I told my driver to stay behind because I needed to do this myself. I drove through the quiet, early morning streets of Atlanta, heading toward the exclusive gated community where my parents lived. At exactly 8 in the morning, I pulled up to their towering wrought iron gates. The neighborhood was perfectly silent, carrying that specific kind of wealthy quiet that comes from old money and overwhelming arrogance. I parked my car just outside their driveway and stepped out into the freezing air. I held the thick manila envelope tightly against my side as I walked up the long, sweeping driveway. The frost crunched softly beneath my boots with every step I took. The house looked like a fortress of pride with its towering white columns and perfectly manicured winter landscaping. I climbed the wide stone steps to their grand front porch and stopped right in front of the massive double doors. I placed the package directly in the center of their pristine welcome mat. I made sure the bold red lettering of the foreclosure notice was slightly visible through the clear plastic window of the envelope, ensuring they would see it the second they looked down. I reached out and firmly pressed the illuminated doorbell. I heard the deep melodic chime echo deep inside the cavernous house. I did not wait to see who would answer the door. I turned around, walked briskly down the stone steps, and made my way back to my car without ever looking back. I slid into the driver's seat, put the car in gear, and began to pull away slowly. As my car reached the end of the street and turned the corner onto the main road, the crisp morning silence was suddenly and violently broken. A piercing, hysterical scream echoed all the way down the block. It was my mother. The sound was raw and full of absolute terror. The package had been opened. The echo of my mother's piercing scream hung in the crisp morning air, slicing through the quiet elegance of that heavily guarded community. I did not tap the brakes. My car glided smoothly onto the main road, the heated leather seats providing a stark contrast to the absolute coldness I felt toward the people inside that massive house. It took exactly 4 minutes for the phone on my dashboard to light up. The screen flashed with a photo of my mother perfectly posed at a country club luncheon, looking like the epitome of Southern grace. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the slow build of anticipation, before pressing the accept button on the steering wheel. She did not bother with a greeting. The audio blasted through my car's surround sound system, a chaotic symphony of hyperventilating and shrill accusations. "What is this fake garbage?" she shrieked. Her voice was so loud the audio actually distorted. "What kind of sick, twisted joke are you playing, Nadine? Why is there a foreclosure notice on my house?" I kept my eyes on the road, my hands resting lightly on my lap. I could picture her standing in that grand foyer, clutching the thick stack of papers, her perfect morning routine completely obliterated. "It isn't a joke, Vivica," I said, my tone as flat and professional as if I were negotiating a corporate merger. She gasped at my use of her first name, but the shock quickly gave way to hysterical denial. "You printed this off the internet," she yelled, her breath catching in her throat. "You are just trying to scare us because you are bitter and jealous of your sister. Julian paid off this mortgage 3 years ago. We had a dinner to celebrate it. He handed us the zero balance statement himself. He freed us from that debt." I listened to her defend the man who had systematically destroyed her financial future. I remembered that night vividly. 3 years ago, Julian had indeed thrown a lavish catered dinner at their estate. He had stood up, raised a glass of imported champagne, and announced to my weeping, grateful parents that he had used his brilliant investment strategies to clear their remaining mortgage. They had toasted him like a king. My mother had looked at me sitting quietly at the end of the table, in a cheap sweater, and asked why I couldn't find a man who could provide for a family like that. I knew then that Julian was a complete fraud, but I didn't have the paperwork to prove it yet. Now I did. Before I could respond to my mother's frantic screaming, I heard the sudden sound of a struggle on the other end of the line. "Give me the phone," my father's voice bellowed in the background. The line fumbled with a harsh scratching noise, and then Desmond's heavy, booming voice filled the car. "Nadine, you have lost your absolute mind," he barked. He was using the exact same aggressive tone he used when I was 18 and told him I wanted to start my own business instead of taking a low-level job at his friend's firm. You forged federal documents just to scare your mother. Do you have any idea how much trouble you are in right now? I will have you arrested for this." I let him vent his fury, knowing his anger was born out of blind, unadulterated terror. He was trying to assert his authority, trying to shrink me back down into the scapegoat role I had occupied my entire life. "Julian is a certified wealth manager," my father lectured, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and desperate denial. "You think you understand high-level finance because you run some little logistics errands. Julian took our house deed specifically to put it into a protected family trust. He sat in my living room and explained the entire process to us. It shields our assets from taxes. It secures Vanessa's inheritance. He is protecting our legacy, and you are pulling some jealous childish prank to try and ruin his reputation." The absolute blind faith they placed in that man was staggering. They were so obsessed with the image of having a high-powered wealth manager as a son-in-law that they never bothered to actually read the documents he put in front of them. They had signed away their entire lives because he wore a nice suit and spoke with unearned confidence. "Dad," I said, cutting smoothly through his tirade. My voice was eerily calm, an impenetrable wall against his mounting panic. "If I forge those documents, then you have absolutely nothing to worry about. But before you call the police on me, I strongly suggest you call the bank." "What are you talking about?" he demanded, though the arrogant bluster in his voice was beginning to show tiny fractures. "I am talking about the phone number on page 2. I instructed, my words precise and measured. It is the direct line to the commercial lending department at Heritage Trust. Call them. Read them the account number listed at the very top of the foreclosure notice. Ask them to verify the current balance of the second mortgage that Julian took out in your name 24 months ago." "You are a liar," my father spat out, but the word lacked its usual venom. He sounded terrified. "Put me on hold, Dad. Call them. I will wait right here." There was a long, heavy silence on the line, followed by the distinctive click of being placed on hold. Generic elevator music began playing through my car speakers. My driver pulled into the underground garage of the Apex Tower and brought the car to a smooth stop. I did not get out. I sat in the dim, quiet luxury of the back seat, listening to the tinny hold music, watching the seconds tick by on the digital dashboard clock. 1 minute. 2 minutes. I pictured my father dialing the number with shaking fingers. I pictured him aggressively demanding that the bank representative clear up this ridiculous misunderstanding immediately. And then I pictured the exact moment the color completely drained from his face as the representative confirmed that the documents were perfectly real. I imagined him listening as the voice on the phone explained that Julian had never paid off the first mortgage and had instead leveraged their home to extract millions of dollars in a second mortgage. I pictured my mother watching him reading the horrifying truth as his arrogant posture finally crumbled. The hold music abruptly cut off. The line connected again with a sharp click. "Dad," I said softly. There was no booming voice. There were no arrogant accusations of forgery or angry lectures about family legacy. There was only the sound of ragged, incredibly heavy breathing. It sounded like a man who had just been punched in the chest and was desperately struggling to pull air into his lungs. He tried to speak a raspy, broken sound, catching hard in his throat, but no actual words came out. The house of cards had not just shaken, it had completely collapsed. I listened to the heavy silence on the line for a long moment. I did not offer any comfort, because he did not deserve any. Before my father could formulate a single coherent sentence, the sound of heavy wooden doors banging open echoed through the phone. I heard my mother's frantic voice yelling something unintelligible, followed by the sharp, rapid click of high heels on imported marble. Vanessa and Julian had arrived. I sat back in the plush leather seat of my Maybach and instructed my driver to take me back to the city. I kept the phone pressed to my ear. The speakerphone function was abruptly engaged on their end, and the absolute chaos of my parents' grand foyer filled my quiet car. "What is going on?" Viveka Julian demanded. His voice was incredibly loud and projected a false sense of absolute authority. He was using the exact same tone he used to intimidate waiters and junior bank tellers. "Why did you call Vanessa screaming about losing the house?" I could hear my father struggling to find his voice. The bank, Desmond choked out. His words sounded like they were scraping against sandpaper. The man on the phone just told me we owe $4 million. He said the original mortgage was never paid off. He said you took out a massive equity line in my name, Julian. There was a fraction of a second of dead silence. I knew exactly what Julian was doing in that moment. He was a cornered rat rapidly calculating his escape route. Then the gaslighting began. It was a masterclass in manipulation and sleight of hand. Desmond, you cannot be serious, Julian said, letting out a condescending little chuckle. You are listening to some low-level bank teller who makes $15 an hour and does not understand complex institutional finance. I am a certified wealth manager. I move tens of millions of dollars in assets for my exclusive clients every single day. What you are seeing is just a temporary hold on the account. It is a standard institutional safeguard when transferring large sums into a protected family trust. I am shielding your money from the federal government, Desmond. I am doing you a favor. But the documents, my mother cried, her voice trembling with hysteria. Nadine left official federal documents on the porch, Julian. The red letters say foreclosure. Julian let out a loud, exasperated sigh that vibrated through the speakerphone. Vivica, he said, speaking to her as if she were a deeply confused toddler. Nadine is clearly experiencing some kind of severe mental breakdown. She forged those papers just to scare you because she is jealous of our success. She probably hired some cheap internet hacker to break into the bank's digital system to trigger a temporary glitch on your account. It is a pathetic, desperate cry for attention because she is a complete failure and she knows it. She wants to drag us down into her miserable little life. My father let out a shaky breath. You are sure, Julian? You are absolutely sure this is just a glitch? He sounded so incredibly weak. He desperately wanted to believe the lie, because the alternative meant admitting he had handed his entire legacy over to a con artist. Of course, I am sure, Julian stated smoothly. I will make one phone call to the regional director and have this cleared up before lunch. Vanessa immediately jumped to her husband's defense. I could hear the aggressive rustling of her expensive wool coat as she snatched the phone closer to her mouth. Are you still on the line, you psycho? Vanessa screamed into the receiver. You are so absolutely pathetic, Nadine. I cannot even believe you would sink this low. You are trying to frame my husband because no man has ever wanted you. You are 32 years old, living in a miserable little apartment, and you cannot stand the fact that I have a perfect life. I listened to her unhinged rant while watching the city skyline come back into view through the tinted windows of my car. Julian is a provider. Vanessa continued, her voice reaching a shrill fever pitch that probably rattled the crystal chandelier above her head. He is a real man who takes care of his family. He is personally funding my $5 million luxury clinic opening. The mayor is coming on Christmas Eve, Nadine. The entire local elite community is going to be there to celebrate me and my brand. Julian secured our wealth while you were driving delivery trucks and making up insane lies to ruin my happiness. You are dead to this family. You will never set foot in my clinic. I let her scream until she literally ran out of breath. I could hear her heavy panting through the speakerphone. The interior of my car was completely silent except for the faint, steady hum of the engine. I leaned my head against the cool leather headrest and let a soft, genuine laugh escape my lips. The sound was quiet, but it seemed to echo through the phone and completely freeze the tension in their grand foyer. You think this is funny? My father rasped, his voice laced with confusion and a mounting, undeniable dread. It is actually hilarious, I replied, keeping my tone incredibly light and conversational. Vanessa, you just said Julian is personally funding your $5 million luxury clinic, right? You said he is a magnificent provider. He is, Vanessa snapped back defensively, though her voice lacked its previous venom. He paid for the entire lease up front. He bought the custom Italian marble countertops. He hired the best commercial contractors in Atlanta to build my dream. I smiled, looking out at the towering glass building of Apex Holdings coming into view in the distance. That is a very beautiful fairy tale, Vanessa, I said softly. But tell me something. Did your generous provider ever actually tell you who owns the building you are leasing for your grand clinic? There was a sudden sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. It was not from Vanessa. It was from Julian. Hang up the phone, Julian screamed. His carefully crafted tone of smooth authority was completely gone. His voice was frantic and shrill, cracking with absolute terror. Hang up the phone right now, Vivica. She is lying. Do not listen to her. Hang it up. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. My words cut through his pathetic panic like a surgical blade. Your clinic is located in a commercial building owned by a real estate entity called Horizon Properties. Vanessa, I stated clearly and slowly, ensuring every single word landed. Horizon Properties was acquired by my private equity firm Apex Holdings 6 months ago. I am the chief executive officer. I am your landlord. And your brilliant wealth manager husband has not paid your rent in 3 months because he blew all the stolen mortgage money on your Italian marble countertops. Vanessa let out a confused, breathless sound. Julian, what is she talking about? Vanessa demanded, her voice rising in panic. What does she mean she is the landlord? Julian was shouting now, his words tumbling over each other in sheer desperation. Give me the phone, Vanessa. Give it to me right now. She is a psychotic liar. She does not own anything. Hang up the phone. I just sat back and listened to the glorious sound of my family finally tearing each other apart. I hung up the phone and tossed it onto the massive marble desk in my office. The silence in my penthouse was deeply satisfying after the chaotic symphony of my family falling apart. I knew they would not just sit in their ruined mansion and accept their fate. Vanessa and Julian were entirely too arrogant to surrender without a face-to-face confrontation. They needed someone to blame, and I was their favorite target. I had listed an older address on some of the documents I left on their porch. It was a modest building I had purchased years ago in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. I kept a small ground-floor unit there for times when I worked late on that side of the city. It looked exactly like the kind of cheap, struggling apartment they always imagined I lived in. I knew Julian would find the address on the paperwork, and I knew Vanessa would demand he drive her there so she could scream at me in person. I left my penthouse and took my driver across town. I unlocked the simple wooden door of the ground-floor unit and stepped inside. The apartment was clean and sparsely furnished. I walked into the small kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I did not have to wait long. Less than an hour later, I heard the aggressive screech of tires pulling up to the curb outside. Heavy, angry footsteps stomped up the concrete walkway. A second later, a violent thud shook the front door. Someone was literally kicking the wood. Open this door right now, Vanessa screamed from the other side. Her voice was muffled through the heavy wood, but the absolute hysteria was unmistakable. Open the door, Nadine, or I swear to God Julian will kick it off the hinges. I placed my glass on the counter and walked slowly toward the entryway. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Vanessa did not even wait for me to step back. She shoved her way inside her expensive designer coat, practically vibrating with her rage. Julian marched in right behind her, his face a mask of furious desperation. He looked completely unhinged. His tie was crooked and he was sweating heavily despite the winter cold. You are going to prison for this! Vanessa shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. She paced around the small living room looking at the plain furniture with absolute disgust. You forged federal banking documents just to ruin my clinic opening. You are a jealous, pathetic loser living in this miserable little dump, and you think you can destroy my life. I stood near the kitchen doorway, completely calm. I let her vent her fury, knowing she was digging her own grave. I am calling my lawyers right now, Julian snarled, stepping forward to try and intimidate me. He puffed out his chest, trying to summon that fake Wall Street authority he loved to use on my father. You messed with the wrong man, Nadine. I work for one of the most powerful financial firms in this state. My corporate legal team will absolutely crush you in court. We will sue you for defamation and harassment. By the time we are done with you, you will be entirely homeless. Vanessa crossed her arms and glared at me with pure venom. He is right, Nadine. Julian is a provider. He is funding my $5 million clinic because he is successful and you are nothing. His firm handles billions of dollars in assets. You picked a fight with a man who can literally buy and sell your entire pathetic existence. I tilted my head and let a soft, amused smile spread across my face. I looked directly into Julian's panicked, sweating eyes. "Vanessa," I said, my voice low and completely steady, "did your incredibly successful husband ever actually tell you who owns the building you are leasing for your clinic? Did he happen to mention that my private equity firm bought the property 6 months ago and that he stopped paying your rent 3 months ago because he embezzled my parents' retirement fund to buy your marble countertops?" Julian lunged forward, his face turning a sickening shade of purple. "Shut your mouth!" he screamed, losing whatever tiny shred of composure he had left. "She is lying, Vanessa. Do not listen to a single word she says. She is a crazy, bitter woman trying to poison our marriage." He turned back to me, his fists clenched at his sides. "You are done, Nadine. I am ruining you. My firm will bury you so deep in legal debt you will never recover." "That is a very bold threat, Julian." A deep, calm voice echoed from the small kitchen directly behind me. Julian froze completely. All the aggressive bluster instantly vanished from his body. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. Vanessa stopped her pacing and stared in confusion as a man stepped out of the kitchen shadows. He was an older, wealthy white man, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his posture radiated genuine, effortless power. He held a simple cup of coffee in his hand and looked at Julian with an expression of absolute profound disgust. Julian took a stumbling step backward. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. "Mr. Sterling." Julian gasped. The name tore out of his throat in a ragged, terrified whisper. "What are you doing here?" Arthur Sterling was the chief executive officer of the massive banking firm where Julian supposedly worked as a senior wealth manager. He was one of the most powerful financial figures in the Southeast, and he was standing in my small kitchen looking at Julian like he was dirt on the bottom of his shoe. Vanessa looked back and forth between her terrified husband and the wealthy stranger. "Julian, who is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. Arthur Sterling took a slow sip of his coffee and stepped up to stand directly beside me. He did not look at Vanessa. His eyes were locked on Julian. "You have been a busy man, Julian," Arthur said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I spent the morning reviewing the files your sister-in-law sent over to my private office. The forged signatures, the unauthorized equity lines, the absolute violation of every federal regulation and ethical standard our firm holds." Julian raised his shaking hands as if he could physically stop the words from hitting him. "Mr. Sterling, I can explain," Julian begged. His voice was incredibly small now. "It was all a misunderstanding. I was managing their portfolio. I can fix it." "You cannot fix federal fraud," Julian Arthur stated flatly. "You leveraged your own in-laws' home to fund a commercial vanity project, and you used our corporate letterhead to fake the documents. You are a disgrace to the financial sector." Vanessa let out a small, choked sound. She finally realized the depth of the nightmare she was standing in. "Julian," she whispered, "tell me he is lying. Tell me you did not steal my parents' money." Julian could not even look at her. He kept his terrified eyes fixed on Arthur. "Please do not let corporate legal crush me." Julian pleaded, tears actually forming in his eyes. "I will pay it back. I just need a little time." Arthur shook his head slowly. He placed a hand respectfully on my shoulder and looked back at Julian. "She does not need a lawyer, Julian," Arthur said, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "Nadine does not need my corporate legal team to crush you. She just bought out our entire firm this morning. Apex Holdings is now the majority shareholder of my bank. She is your new boss." Julian swayed on his feet, his mouth opening and closing without making a sound. "And you are fired," Arthur finished, turning his back on the ruined man. I stood there, watching Julian's knees actually buckle. Vanessa covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a long, horrified wail as the reality of her absolute destruction finally crashed down around her. They had come to threaten a peasant and found themselves standing in the court of the Queen. Arthur Sterling turned on his heel and walked out of my apartment, leaving the heavy wooden door wide open behind him. The sharp click of his expensive leather shoes faded down the quiet hallway. The silence that filled my small kitchen was absolute and incredibly heavy. They had come to threaten a peasant and found themselves standing in the court of the Queen. Julian collapsed. His knees hit the cheap linoleum floor with a loud, violent thud. The arrogant Wall Street facade completely melted away, leaving nothing but a pathetic, sobbing shell of a man. His expensive tailored suit bunched up around his shoulders as he covered his face with his trembling hands. He began to weep. Loud, ugly, gasping sobs echoed off the bare, white walls of the apartment. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, dragging himself across the floor like a beaten dog. He reached out and grabbed the hem of my simple beige pants. "Nadine, please," he choked out. His face was slick with cold sweat and desperate tears. "Please, you have to call him back. You cannot do this to me. I will go to federal prison. I will lose absolutely everything. Just give me my job back and I will fix the accounts. I will work for you for free. I will clean the floors of your building. Just please do not let them audit my files." Vanessa stared down at her husband in absolute disgust. Her perfect features contorted into a mask of pure rage and stubborn denial. She refused to accept that her golden life was built on a foundation of lies. She kicked Julian's leg with the pointed toe of her designer boot. "Get up, Julian," she shrieked. Her voice cracked with shrill hysteria. "Stop playing along with this sick prank. Get off the floor right now before you ruin your suit. She is lying. This is just some elaborate trick because she is a jealous, bitter spinster. She probably hired a cheap local actor to play your boss just to humiliate us. Get up and act like a real man." Julian did not move. He just kept crying into the floor, shaking his head back and forth in pure misery. "He is not an actor, Vanessa," he sobbed. "That was Arthur Sterling. She really bought the firm. It is over. We are completely ruined and I am going to jail." I looked down at the pathetic scene unfolding on my kitchen floor. I felt absolutely no pity for either of them. I calmly turned to the small stack of papers I had left on the kitchen counter. I picked up the top document and held it out toward my sister. "Read it, Vanessa," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "Read the federal audit report. Your brilliant provider husband embezzled $4 million from his institutional clients. And when that was not enough to cover his failing stock bets, he stole another $2 million directly from mom and dad. He drained their entire retirement fund and secretly mortgaged their massive estate. He did all of this just to pay for your lavish internet lifestyle and your ridiculous vanity clinic." Vanessa refused to look at the papers. Her eyes were wild and frantic. She swatted my hand away violently, the thick stack of financial documents scattered across the floor landing right next to Julian's tear-stained face. Liar Vanessa screamed at the top of her lungs. The veins in her neck were bulging, and her perfectly applied makeup was starting to run down her cheeks. "You are a disgusting liar, Nadine. You have always tried to ruin my happiness because you are miserable and alone. You cannot touch me. You will never be on my level. My luxury clinic opens in exactly 48 hours. The mayor is coming to personally cut the ribbon. I have hundreds of elite, wealthy clients booked for the next 6 months. My business is going to make millions, and you are going to rot in this tiny apartment. You cannot stop me, and you cannot stop my success." I slowly stepped closer to her, closing the distance until we were inches apart. She tried to maintain her defiant glare, but I could see the absolute terror trembling behind her eyes. I let a very cold, satisfied smile spread across my face. "Vanessa," I said softly, making sure she heard every single syllable clearly. "Did Julian forget to mention who actually owns the commercial building you are leasing for your clinic?" Vanessa stopped breathing. Her chest froze and her eyes widened in confusion. Julian let out another loud, agonizing wail from his spot on the floor. "I am the owner of Horizon Properties," I explained, watching the devastating realization finally wash over her face. "I am your landlord, Vanessa, and you are officially 3 months behind on your rent. Julian stopped paying it because he ran out of stolen money. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my building. If you are not completely moved out by tomorrow morning, I will send the county sheriff to drag your expensive medical equipment and your imported Italian marble out into the street. There will be no grand opening. There will be no ribbon cutting. There will only be padlocks on the doors and a public eviction notice taped to the front window. Vanessa staggered backward as if I had physically struck her. She bumped into the counter and gripped the edge to keep from falling. She looked down at Julian, who was still curled in a pathetic ball on the floor, weeping into the scattered pages of his own financial crimes. The perfect life she loved to brag about had vanished into thin air. She had spent years mocking me and calling me a failure, but now she was the one with absolutely nothing. I stood in my kitchen and watched the golden child realize that she was entirely at my mercy. Vanessa staggered backward, as if she had been physically struck by my words. She bumped into the counter and gripped the edge tightly just to keep herself from falling over. She looked down at Julian, who was still curled in a pathetic ball on the floor, weeping violently into the scattered pages of his own financial crimes. The perfect, luxurious life she loved to brag about had vanished into thin air in a matter of minutes. She had spent years mocking me and calling me a failure, but now she was the one with absolutely nothing. "Get up!" she hissed at him, her voice cracking with a mixture of terror and rage. "We are leaving right now." She grabbed his arm and yanked him to his feet. Julian stumbled heavily, looking back at me with eyes full of absolute begging terror, but I just pointed silently toward the open door. They scrambled out into the hallway like frightened animals fleeing a burning building. I quietly closed the door and locked the deadbolt, leaving them to face the reality of their completely ruined lives. The next morning, I sat behind the massive mahogany desk in my true office at Apex Holdings. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the entire city skyline, a stark, glaring contrast to the cheap, struggling apartment my family thought I lived in. The office was decorated in subtle tones of wealth, with original artwork and custom leather furniture. I was reviewing the final legal eviction paperwork for Vanessa's commercial clinic space when the intercom on my desk buzzed loudly. My executive assistant informed me that my parents were waiting in the main lobby downstairs, and they were demanding to see me immediately. They were apparently causing quite a scene and threatening to call the police if they were not allowed upstairs. I smiled a cold, satisfied smile and told security to send them directly up to the penthouse suite. The private elevator doors slid open directly into my reception area. I watched through the soundproof glass walls of my office as my mother and father stepped out. They immediately froze in their tracks. Vivica looked around the expansive suite, taking in the imported Italian marble floors, the expensive modern art, and the highly professional team of administrative staff working quietly at their sleek desks. Desmond stared openly at the massive corporate logo embossed in brushed silver on the main wall. For a brief, glorious moment, I saw pure shock register on their faces as they finally comprehended the sheer magnitude of the wealth and power I had built completely without their help. But the shock did not turn into pride or regret, or even a simple apology. As they pushed open my heavy glass door, it instantly curdled into demanding, arrogant entitlement. They marched directly into my office, completely ignoring my assistant who tried to stop them. My mother did not even bother to say hello. She slammed her expensive designer leather handbag down on my pristine desk. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her perfectly styled hair was slightly out of place. "Nadine, you have all this money!" Vivica cried out, her voice shrill and echoing with desperate panic. "Pay off Julian's debt. If the church finds out we are bankrupt, we will be ruined. Vanessa's clinic must open. You have to sacrifice for your sister, just like when you gave up your college fund so she could go to med school." The casual way she brought up the college fund felt like a physical blow to my chest. When I was 18, my parents emptied the savings account they had promised me for my business degree and handed every single penny to Vanessa because she decided she wanted to be a doctor. They told me I was not smart enough for college anyway and that I should just find a low-paying job while Vanessa pursued a real career. I had spent years scrubbing floors and working 3 exhausting jobs to build my company from absolute nothing, while they paid for her luxury apartments and expensive vacations. And now, standing in the literal empire I built with my own bare hands, my mother was demanding I sacrifice for Vanessa one more time. I remained perfectly still, resting my hands calmly on my desk. I looked at my parents, feeling the last tiny thread of emotional attachment to them snap and wither away completely. You want me to pay $6 million to save the man who stole from you and the sister who slapped me? I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper. You want me to just open my checkbook so you can keep pretending you have a perfect, flawless life? Desmond stepped forward, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of fake, arrogant authority. If you do not do this, you are dead to us, he threatened, his voice echoing off the glass walls. We will never speak to you again. You will have no family. You will be entirely alone in this world. Write the check right now, or we are walking out that door forever. I sat back in my plush leather chair and looked at the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. They were so desperate to protect the golden child and their fake reputation that they were willing to throw me away one final time. I reached over and slowly closed the folder containing the eviction notice. I looked up at my father and nodded, offering him a slow, chilling smile. Okay, I said, my voice perfectly smooth and light. I will see you at the grand opening. Christmas Eve arrived with a bitter chill in the air, but inside Vanessa's luxury dermatology clinic, the atmosphere was suffocatingly warm and dripping with unearned opulence. I sat in the darkness of the second-floor mezzanine, watching the spectacle unfold below me through the glass balustrade. The street outside was blocked off for a red carpet entrance. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to park a parade of luxury vehicles. Inside, a string quartet played holiday classics, while servers circulated with silver trays of imported champagne and beluga caviar. Every square inch of the clinic screamed of desperate extravagance. The custom Italian marble countertops gleamed under crystal chandeliers. The waiting area was furnished with imported white leather sofas and massive modern art pieces. It was a $5 million monument to my sister's ego built entirely on stolen money and my parents' ruined future. Vanessa was completely in her element. She glided across the pristine floor in a custom silk gown, looking like a queen surveying her devoted subjects. She stopped to pose for photos with local celebrities and gave breathless interviews to lifestyle bloggers about her brilliant vision for medical aesthetics. She laughed loudly, tossing her head back and soaking in the admiration of every person in the room. Julian stood rigidly by her side, playing the role of the devoted, wealthy husband. He was wearing a bespoke tuxedo, but I could see the heavy sheen of nervous sweat coating his forehead. He kept glancing toward the main entrance, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a man waiting for the executioner to arrive. He knew I had not paid the debt. He knew the eviction notice I had handed them was legally binding and that they were trespassing on my property. But he was too terrified to tell Vanessa the truth, so he just stood there drinking his champagne too fast and pretending the floor was not about to fall out from under them. My parents were holding court near a massive imported ice sculpture carved in the shape of Vanessa's business logo. Vivica and Desmond were practically glowing with smug satisfaction. They were surrounded by the most prominent elders from their church and several local politicians, including the mayor who was slated to cut the grand ribbon. I listened as my mother's voice drifted up to the mezzanine. She was boasting loudly about Julian's incredible financial acumen and Vanessa's unparalleled brilliance. They are a true power couple, Vivica announced to the mayor, holding her champagne flute high. Julian manages wealth for the absolute elite, and he completely funded this entire project himself. He is the greatest son-in-law anyone could ever ask for. He protects our family legacy so perfectly. My father nodded proudly, clapping a hand on the shoulder of a church elder. We are truly blessed, Desmond added. We raised Vanessa to expect nothing but the absolute best, and Julian delivered. It is just wonderful to see hard work and honest family values rewarded like this. Watching them, I realized the absolute depth of their delusion. When I told them I would see them at the grand opening, they genuinely believed I had surrendered. They thought my lifelong desperate need for their validation had won out over my own self-respect. They assumed I had quietly wired $6 million to cover Julian's criminal embezzlement and save the family name. In their twisted minds, I had finally learned my place and performed my duty as the invisible bank account while Vanessa took the spotlight. They thought I was sitting at home in my modest apartment eating a microwave dinner and crying while they toasted to their fake success. They had spent my entire life stepping on my neck, and they honestly believed I would just let them keep doing it forever. I checked my watch. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. The mayor stepped up to a small podium near the grand staircase holding a pair of oversized golden scissors. The string quartet finished their song, and a polite hush fell over the glittering crowd. Vanessa moved to the front of the room, pulling a sweating, trembling Julian along with her. She beamed at the flashing cameras, her perfect smile firmly in place, ready to accept her crown. "Thank you all for coming," Vanessa said, her voice echoing clearly through the pristine space. "Tonight is a celebration of beauty, wealth, and family. I want to personally thank my amazing husband Julian for making this dream a reality." The crowd broke into polite applause. Vivica wiped a fake tear from her eye. Julian looked like he was going to be physically sick. It was time. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, opening the security application for the commercial building management system. With one single tap of my thumb, I initiated the master override. The soft ambient music playing through the overhead speakers abruptly cut off, replacing the cheerful atmosphere with a sudden, jarring silence. A second later, the heavy electronic locks on the main glass entrance doors engaged with a loud, definitive metallic click that echoed sharply through the large room. The crowd murmured in confusion as the brilliant crystal chandeliers suddenly dimmed, plunging the luxurious space into heavy shadows. The mayor lowered his golden scissors, looking around in alarm. Vanessa let out a sharp gasp of annoyance, demanding to know what was wrong with the power and yelling for the event coordinator to fix it immediately. Vivica grabbed Desmond's arm, looking around the darkened room with sudden apprehension. Before Vanessa could scream at another staff member, a single brilliant white spotlight snapped on, piercing through the dimness. The blinding beam of light hit the very top of the grand marble staircase, illuminating me exactly where I stood. I looked down at the sea of upturned, shocked faces. I watched the absolute horror wash over my parents and my sister as they finally realized I was not there to save them. I raised the wireless microphone to my lips and smiled. The crowd stared up at me in absolute stunned silence. The soft rustle of expensive imported silk and the polite clinking of crystal champagne glasses completely stopped. The sudden quiet was so profound that I could hear the gentle hum of the central heating system above us. Vanessa broke the silence first. Her face contorted into an ugly, twisted mask of pure, unadulterated fury as she pointed a shaking, manicured finger up at the top of the staircase. "Security!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, shrill hysteria that echoed off the marble walls. "Get this jealous freak out of my clinic right now. She is trespassing. Throw her out into the street." Several large, muscular men in sharp black suits stepped forward from the deep shadows of the lobby area. Vanessa let out a triumphant, breathless bark of laughter, fully expecting them to rush up the carpeted stairs and drag me away by my arms. She crossed her arms over her chest and waited for her command to be executed. But the security guards did not even look in my direction. Instead, they moved in perfect synchronized military unison toward the front of the room. They bypassed Vanessa, completely ignoring her shrill demands, and stepped directly in front of the heavy locked glass exit doors. They crossed their arms and planted their feet wide, effectively barricading the only way out of the building. They were not there to remove me. They were there to make absolutely sure Julian did not try to run away before the authorities arrived. Julian let out a pathetic, high-pitched squeaking noise. He stumbled backward, dropping his expensive champagne flute. The delicate crystal shattered into a dozen sparkling pieces across the pristine Italian marble floor, but no one in the crowd even bothered to look down. He realized exactly what was happening, and the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, sickly ghost. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to lean against a structural pillar just to keep himself upright. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp thumping sound echoed loudly through the cavernous space, demanding the absolute, undivided attention of every single person in the room. "Welcome, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly and powerfully over the high-quality sound system. "Welcome to the grand opening of my new building." I paused, letting the heavy words hang in the cold air. The mayor looked thoroughly confused, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. The church elders exchanged deeply concerned, alarmed glances. The local lifestyle bloggers immediately pulled out their phones, sensing a massive scandal unfolding right in front of them. "I am Nadine," I continued, looking directly down into Vanessa's wide, terrified eyes. "I am the owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings." A collective loud gasp rippled through the crowd of elite wealthy guests. The name of my firm carried massive, undeniable weight in this city, and hearing it spoken aloud sent a visible shockwave through the room. People began whispering furiously to one another, connecting the dots between the massive corporate entity and the woman standing on the staircase. I let a slow, highly satisfied smile spread across my face as I watched my sister's perfect, curated world shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "I want to thank my sister Vanessa," I announced, my voice dripping with sweet, poisonous sincerity. "I want to thank her for hosting this lovely, highly catered event for my corporate takeover." Vanessa staggered backward as if I had physically shot her. She bumped hard into the presentation podium, sending the oversized golden ribbon, cutting scissors, clattering loudly to the floor. She looked wildly around the room, searching for someone, anyone to intervene, and tell her this was just a horrible hallucination. She looked at Julian, begging him to do something to fix it, but he was already backed into a corner, sobbing quietly into his shaking hands. The brilliant, glowing facade of her life was peeling away, revealing the ugly, rotten truth underneath. Down near the melting ice sculpture, Desmond finally broke free from his state of paralyzed disbelief. His face flushed a dark, dangerous crimson red as he forcefully pushed his way through the crowd of bewildered politicians and church leaders. He marched toward the bottom of the grand staircase, shaking his fist up at me with blind, familiar rage. "Nadine, stop this right now!" he yelled, his voice booming with entitled patriarchal fury. His chest was heaving, and a thick purple vein pulsed visibly in his forehead. He pointed a demanding finger at me, completely forgetting that we were surrounded by the most important people in the city. "You promised us!" Desmond bellowed, completely uncaring that the entire room was watching his public meltdown. "You looked me in the eye and you promised you fixed this." The murmurs in the crowd escalated into a loud, chaotic buzz. People were pointing and whispering furiously, pulling out their cell phones, and blatantly recording the disastrous spectacle unfolding right in front of them. Vivica tried to pull Desmond back by his suit jacket, desperately trying to save face in front of the mayor and the church elders, but he shoved her manicured hand away violently. He was so accustomed to controlling me through fear and intimidation that he simply could not process what was happening. I looked down at the man who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was a worthless, lazy disappointment. He actually believed he still had authority over me. He honestly thought he could command me to fall back into line and cover up his precious golden child's massive criminal failures, just like he always did. He thought my quiet compliance earlier meant I was surrendering my hard-earned money to save their pathetic social standing. I leaned slightly closer to the microphone. The bright white spotlight felt warm and empowering against my skin. I stood tall and confident, feeling the absolute solid weight of my own success backing me up. "Oh, Dad," I said, my voice echoing softly, but carrying a razor-sharp edge that cut right through his arrogant, useless bluster. "I did fix it." I looked at the muscular security guards standing like stone statues blocking the exits, ensuring no one escaped accountability. I looked at Julian weeping in the corner, knowing federal investigators were already reviewing his frozen accounts. I looked at Vanessa, whose fake luxury empire had just been legally and publicly absorbed into my own legitimate company. And finally, I smiled down at my parents, watching their entire fake legacy collapse into a pile of worthless dust right in front of their wealthy peers. I fixed it permanently. I fixed it permanently, I repeated, letting the words echo in the absolute silence of the room. I raised my hand and tapped the screen of my phone one more time. High above us, in the custom recessed ceiling, a heavy mechanical hum vibrated through the air. A massive high-definition projector descended from the hidden panel, casting a blinding rectangle of light directly onto the pristine white Italian marble wall behind the main reception desk. The crowd turned as one collective entity to stare at the massive glowing projection. I watched my father's face turn an unnatural shade of chalky gray as the first document appeared on the wall in towering 10-foot letters. It was a high-resolution scanned copy of the official property deed to my parents' massive suburban estate. This was the exact same estate my mother constantly bragged about at every single church function and country club dinner she ever attended. It was their ultimate symbol of superiority. If you look closely at the bottom right corner, I announced, my voice echoing cleanly through the state-of-the-art sound system, you will see the signature of the man who just financed this beautiful luxury clinic. But you will also notice that he did not use his own name. The image on the wall zoomed in dramatically, magnifying the hasty, jagged signature. A loud collective gasp rippled through the entire crowd of elite, wealthy guests. The church elders leaned forward, squinting heavily at the glowing screen. It was unmistakably Julian's handwriting, but he had blatantly forged Desmond's signature. He had secretly mortgaged my parents' family estate to the absolute maximum legal limit just to keep Vanessa's luxurious delusion afloat and fund this building. Desmond let out a strangled wheezing noise, holding his trembling hands up to his chest, as if he was having a massive heart attack right there on the red carpet. He stumbled backward, knocking into Vivica, who was already shaking violently. But I was not finished stripping away their perfect illusion. I tapped my phone screen again, and the giant image shifted. "This next document is even more interesting," I said, pacing slowly along the top of the grand staircase, looking down like a judge delivering a final sentence. The screen now displayed a joint retirement account statement bearing both of my parents' full names. I highlighted the final balance column, blowing it up so that even the people standing all the way in the back by the valet entrance could see it perfectly clearly. $0.00. I read aloud, letting the absolute brutal devastation of that number sink into the room. A retirement fund that took 40 years of careful planning to build completely drained down to nothing. Julian wired every single penny of it into untraceable offshore accounts to cover his failing aggressive stock bets and to pay for the imported beluga caviar you are all eating right now. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and entirely brutal. The polite upper-class silence completely shattered into a million pieces. The church gossips who had spent years kissing my mother's feet and praising her golden family immediately began whispering loudly to one another, their eyes wide with scandalous delight. I saw the mayor quietly motion to his private security detail and slip out the side door, completely abandoning the highly publicized ribbon-cutting ceremony to avoid being associated with a massive federal financial crime. Vivica let out a loud, agonizing wail that sounded like a dying animal. She grabbed her hair, completely ruining her expensive salon blowout, and sank to her knees right there on the imported Persian rugs. She realized in that exact agonizing moment that she was completely destitute. The country club memberships, the designer clothes, the wealthy social status she used to bludgeon me with my entire life were all gone forever. Desmond just stared blankly at the wall, his jaw hanging open in pure, unadulterated shock. He was a ruined, bankrupt man entirely because he trusted his golden son-in-law over his own blood daughter. Vanessa finally snapped. The absolute public destruction of her perfect brand was too much for her fragile, narcissistic ego to handle. She let out a guttural, animalistic scream that tore through the beautiful clinic. She kicked off her expensive designer heels and lunged toward the grand staircase, her hands curled into vicious claws. "You are ruining my brand!" she shrieked, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. You are a disgusting, jealous freak, Nadine. You planned this just to humiliate me because you will never be as good as me. Get this jealous freak out of my clinic right now. She tried to sprint up the marble stairs to physically attack me, but she did not even make it past the second step. The security guards I had stationed at the doors moved with terrifying speed. Two massive men in black suits intercepted her effortlessly, catching her flailing arms and pinning them firmly to her sides. Vanessa thrashed and kicked against them, acting like a completely unhinged toddler throwing a temper tantrum. "Let me go," she screamed wildly, spit flying from her lips as she struggled uselessly against the guards. "I am a doctor. I am a highly respected medical professional. I own this clinic. You cannot treat me like this. You work for me." The apex-holding security guards did not even blink. They held her firmly in place, completely ignoring her frantic, arrogant demands. Julian was still cowering in the corner, weeping loudly, and refusing to even look at his wife while she publicly humiliated herself in front of the entire city elite. "You do not own anything?" "Vanessa?" I said, my voice dropping to a calm conversational tone that somehow cut right through all of her pathetic screaming. "You are a tenant who is 3 months behind on rent and currently facing a federal investigation for receiving millions in stolen funds." Vanessa stopped struggling for a split second, her chest heaving as she glared up at me with murderous intent. "You are lying," she hissed, trying to rip her arms free again. "You cannot touch my medical license. I earned that. I am a doctor, and no one can take that away from me." I smiled gently and lowered the microphone from my lips. "You are absolutely right, Vanessa," I said, projecting my voice so she could hear me clearly. "I cannot take your medical license away, but I know someone who can." I stepped aside and gestured toward the deep shadows near the VIP seating area. A tall, distinguished older man in a sharp gray suit stepped forward into the light. The murmurs in the crowd instantly died down as several of the local doctors and medical professionals in the room immediately recognized him. It was the chief medical officer of the state medical board. I handed the microphone down to him as he stopped at the bottom of the stairs, standing directly in front of the struggling, thrashing Vanessa. He looked at my sister with an expression of absolute professional disgust. He adjusted his glasses and lifted the microphone. "Actually, Dr. Vanessa," he said, his deep authoritative voice echoing through the ruined clinic. "Due to the $2 million in stolen, embezzled funds used to illegally finance this medical facility, your medical license is officially suspended, effective immediately pending a full federal investigation." The words "federal investigation" hung in the heavy air of the clinic like a death sentence. Julian finally snapped out of his paralyzed state of sheer terror. The absolute reality of his crimes caught up to him in a violent rush of adrenaline. He let out a strange panicked sound that was half gasp and half sob, and he turned blindly toward the back of the room. He did not care about Vanessa or his ruined reputation anymore. He only cared about saving his own skin. He bolted. Julian shoved his way through the crowd of stunned elite guests, tearing through the beautiful, elegant display with the frantic clumsiness of a trapped rat. He pushed violently past the church elders, knocking a young waiter completely off balance. A massive silver tray of expensive crystal champagne flutes crashed hard onto the Italian marble floor, shattering into hundreds of glittering shards. Julian did not even look back. He slipped on the spilled champagne, ruining his custom-tailored tuxedo pants, but he scrambled upright and kept running toward the rear service exit. He hit the heavy metal crash bar with his entire shoulder, expecting to burst out into the cool, dark alleyway and disappear into the city night. He shoved the heavy door open, but he did not make it a single step outside. 3 federal agents were standing shoulder to shoulder on the loading dock, blocking the entire exit. They did not look surprised or alarmed. They were waiting for him. The harsh glare of the alley security lights caught the silver badges clipped to their dark windbreakers. Julian let out a pathetic whimpering noise and tried to backpedal into the clinic, but the agents moved with terrifying practice speed. 2 of them grabbed his arms, twisting them forcefully behind his back, while the third pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp, distinct metallic click of the cuffs locking around Julian's wrists echoed perfectly into the silent, luxurious clinic. Everyone in the room simply stared in absolute shock as the brilliant, wealthy financial advisor was slammed against the metal doorframe and read his rights. Julian began to sob hysterically, his face slick with cold sweat and tears of absolute cowardice. He looked back into the brightly lit room, his eyes searching frantically for the man who had always protected him. Desmond! He screamed, his voice cracking with high-pitched desperation. Desmond, you have to help me. Call your lawyers. Tell them it is a mistake. You have to bail me out, Desmond, please. But Desmond could not help him. My father was leaning heavily against a marble structural pillar, clutching his chest with both of his shaking hands. His face had drained of all its arrogant color, replaced by a terrifying, sickly shade of purple. He was struggling to pull air into his lungs as the massive, crushing weight of his absolute financial ruin finally squeezed the last remaining breath out of him. He stared at his golden son-in-law, watching the man he had trusted with his entire life savings being dragged away in chains. Desmond realized in that agonizing, suffocating moment that his genius son-in-law had completely destroyed him. He had handed over every single penny of his wealth, his home, and his future to a pathetic criminal just because Julian knew how to play the role of the perfect elite gentleman. Down on the floor, Vivica was completely losing whatever tiny fragment of her mind she had left. She did not rush to comfort her struggling husband or her weeping daughter. She simply fell forward onto her hands and knees, her expensive silk dress pooling around her in a pathetic heap. She slammed her fists against the pristine marble floor and screamed. It was a loud, ugly sound, completely devoid of any real maternal grief. My house, Vivica wailed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. My country club membership, my garden club luncheons, it is all gone. Everything is gone. We are ruined. She rocked back and forth, weeping uncontrollably for the only things she had ever truly loved in her entire life: her money and her fake social status. Vanessa stood frozen in the center of the room, watching her luxurious golden empire burn to the ground around her. She looked at her husband being dragged into the dark alley by federal agents. She looked at her father clutching his failing heart, and her mother weeping over a lost country club membership on the floor. Her medical license was suspended, her business was seized, her reputation was permanently, completely annihilated in front of the mayor and the most important people in the city. Her mind completely snapped under the pressure. She slowly turned away from the chaos and fixed her wild, manic eyes directly on me. Her chest heaved with ragged, heavy breaths, and the last remaining shred of her composed, elegant facade vanished completely. "You planned this!" Vanessa screamed, pointing a shaking finger up at the balcony. Her voice was raw and shredded, echoing with absolute pure delusion. "You set us up, Nadine. You wanted me to fail because you have always been a jealous, bitter freak. You want me to be homeless. You want me to lose everything." She tried to push past the security guards again, but they held her back effortlessly. She thrashed against them, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her tear-stained face. "You have to fix this, Nadine," she shrieked, her voice breaking into a desperate, ugly sob. "You have the money. You own this building. You owe us. You have to save me. I am your sister." The entire room watched, holding their collective breath, as I looked down at the hysterical, ruined woman, demanding my money. I slowly turned and began to descend the grand marble staircase. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the sharp, confident click of my heels echo loudly through the silent, devastated room. I walked all the way down until I was standing on the main floor directly in front of the security guards who were restraining her. I stepped close, towering over her pathetic, shrinking form. I looked into her wide, terrified eyes and let a cold, absolutely merciless smile touch my lips. "I am not your sister," I said, my voice perfectly level and loud enough for every single person in the room to hear. "I am your biggest creditor." The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles strobed violently through the massive glass windows of the clinic before finally pulling away into the cold city night. The departure of the authorities seemed to break the invisible spell that had frozen the elite crowd. Like roaches fleeing a suddenly illuminated room, the local politicians, the church elders, and the wealthy socialites scrambled for the exits. They whispered frantically to one another, practically tripping over their own expensive imported shoes to get away from the radioactive scandal of my family. The string quartet had packed up their instruments and fled long ago. The catering staff completely abandoned their silver trays of beluga caviar and imported champagne, leaving them to spoil on the custom Italian marble countertops. Within 15 short minutes, the sprawling $5 million monument to my sister's massive ego was completely empty. The heavy silence that fell over the cavernous space was deafening. It was broken only by the pathetic sound of my mother Vivica quietly weeping on the floor. Her expensive designer gown was completely ruined, soaking up puddles of spilled champagne and melted ice, but she did not even seem to notice. Vanessa stood perfectly paralyzed near the grand staircase, staring blankly at the front glass doors, where her husband had just been dragged away in handcuffs. She looked like a hollow plastic mannequin whose internal batteries had finally run out. Her perfectly styled hair was a messy, tangled wreck around her pale face. And then there was Desmond. My father, the proud, arrogant man, who had spent my entire life standing tall and looking down his nose at my absolute existence, was now visibly shrinking in front of my eyes. His breathing was shallow and ragged. He leaned heavily against the sleek modern registration desk, rubbing his chest, as the terrifying reality of his absolute financial ruin settled deeply into his aging bones. The invincible golden patriarch was gone, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, weak old man who had bet his entire legacy on the wrong child. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The arrogant, familiar fire that usually burned in his dark eyes was completely extinguished, replaced by a pathetic, hollow terror. He pushed himself off the desk, his legs trembling noticeably underneath his bespoke, tailored suit. He took a slow, shuffling step toward me, acting as if the pristine marble floor was made of thin, cracking ice that might swallow him whole. "Nadine." He croaked, his voice thin and fragile, sounding exactly like a dying man begging for his final meal. "You have to understand what Julian did to us. He took everything. The retirement accounts, the savings, the investment portfolios. It is all completely gone." He swallowed hard, a single tear finally spilling over his wrinkled cheek and cutting a path through the sheen of cold sweat on his face. "The bank called me yesterday afternoon, Nadine. Julian missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments on the family estate while he was funneling money into this fake clinic. The foreclosure notice is already finalized. They are sending the local authorities to seize the house and lock the gates on Monday morning." He reached out a shaking, wrinkled hand toward me, but he did not dare to actually touch me. "Please, Nadine," he begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic, miserable sob that echoed loudly in the empty room. "Please, you have the money now. You have the power to stop them. Where will your mother and I go? We have no savings left. We will be out on the street with nothing but the clothes on our backs. You cannot let them take our home, Nadine, please." I stood there in the center of the glittering, empty clinic and watched the man who had verbally and emotionally abused me for my entire existence completely break down and beg for my mercy. I felt absolutely no pity for him. I felt no warmth, no sorrow, no lingering familial obligation. I only felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a perfectly executed hostile business transaction. They had treated me like a useless bank account for decades, and now they were finally learning what happens when the bank decides to collect on its debts. I slowly reached down into my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents securely bound by a large black metal clip. The sharp, crisp sound of the paper slicing through the silent room made Vanessa physically flinch. I did not hand the documents to my father. I simply tossed them forward, letting them hit the hard marble floor with a heavy, definitive smack. They slid across the polished surface, stopping right at Desmond's trembling, expensive leather shoes. Desmond stared down at the papers in absolute confusion, his hands hovering nervously in the air. I looked at my parents, watching the desperate, pathetic hope trying to claw its way back into their terrified, tear-stained eyes. "I bought your mortgage from the bank," I stated, my voice echoing coldly through the empty, silent clinic. I paid the outstanding balance in full yesterday afternoon through one of my corporate subsidiaries. I own your house now. Vivica let out a loud, dramatic gasp of relief, scrambling to her feet and preparing to rush forward and thank me, but I held up my hand to stop her dead in her tracks. You can stay in it. I continued, my gaze slowly shifting away from my parents to lock directly onto my sister's pale, ruined face. You can live in my house, rent-free for the rest of your lives, but there is one strict, non-negotiable condition. Vanessa stopped breathing. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a sudden dawning horror as she realized exactly what I was about to say. The last remaining pieces of her arrogant entitlement shattered as she finally understood the absolute magnitude of my revenge. I raised a single, perfectly manicured finger and pointed it squarely at Vanessa's chest. She does not get to live there. Vivica's face twisted into an expression of absolute horrified disbelief as the heavy words finally registered in her frantic mind. She scrambled up from the cold marble floor, her ruined designer silk dress clinging to her shaking legs as she threw herself toward the bottom of the grand staircase. Her manicured hands reached out, grasping desperately at the empty air between us, as if she could physically pull the words back into my mouth and erase the nightmare. "You cannot make us choose between our daughters," she screamed, her voice cracking and echoing wildly through the cavernous abandoned clinic. She looked back at Vanessa, who was still being held firmly by my elite security guards, and then looked back up at me with wild, pleading eyes. "Vanessa has absolutely nothing left, Nadine. Julian is on his way to a federal holding cell, and her entire business is completely gone. Where is she supposed to go?" I slowly descended the final 2 steps until I was standing completely level with my weeping mother. I leaned in extremely close to her tear-stained face, letting her see the absolute pristine coldness in my eyes. I did not raise my voice, but my words carried the sharp, lethal weight of a loaded weapon. "Where did I go 5 years ago, Mother?" I asked softly, watching her breath hitch painfully in her throat. "Where did I go when you and Dad threw all of my belongings onto the front lawn and changed the locks just because I finally refused to drain my tiny savings account to pay for Vanessa's imported luxury sports car?" Vivica physically recoiled as the painful memory was violently dragged back out into the open. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to hide from the absolute ugly truth of what she had done to me, but I stepped even closer, refusing to let her look away. I lived in the back seat of my used compact car for 4 agonizing months, in the dead of winter. I whispered, my voice steady and completely unforgiving. I parked under broken streetlights behind cheap grocery stores so I would not get mugged while I worked 3 different minimum wage shifts just to survive. So if you are wondering where your precious golden child is supposed to go tonight, she can always try the back seat of her car. I hear it builds excellent character. Vanessa let out a strangled, pathetic noise from across the room. She thrashed against the security guards one last time, but her energy was completely spent. She sagged against their strong grip, her perfect posture crumbling as she realized I was entirely serious. She was going to be thrown out into the cold night street with absolutely nothing to her name. She looked at our parents, waiting for them to unleash their usual protective fury on me, but there was no fury left in them. There was only the terrifying, crushing reality of their own impending homelessness staring them right in the face. Desmond pushed himself away from the sleek reception desk, his breathing still heavy and ragged. He stared at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the floor near his feet. Those papers represented the absolute complete transfer of his entire life and legacy into my hands. If he signed them, he would become a permanent dependent living purely on the strictly controlled charity of the daughter he had spent decades treating like absolute garbage. But if he refused, he would be sleeping on the concrete sidewalk right next to his precious golden child by Monday morning. He looked at Vanessa, and for the very first time in my entire life, I saw him look at her with something resembling pure disgust. She was the direct reason he had lost everything. Her boundless greed and his blind enabling had literally cost him his entire kingdom. I slowly lifted my left arm and made a highly deliberate show of checking my custom diamond watch. The glittering stones caught the harsh security lighting, casting tiny shattered reflections across the dark room. I looked back down at the broken man standing in front of me. "You have exactly 60 seconds to sign that deed transfer, Desmond," I stated, my voice cutting through the thick silence like a pristine, sharp blade. "You either sign those papers right now and accept my incredibly generous offer of shelter, or I pack up my briefcase and walk out that door. And if I walk out that door, the county sheriff will be at your front gate on Monday morning with a full eviction crew to throw all of your expensive antique furniture into a dumpster." Vivica let out another wailing sob, begging Desmond to do something to fix this absolute nightmare. She grabbed his arm, pleading with him to save their beautiful estate, but he did not even look at her. He kept his hollow, defeated eyes locked entirely on me. He was searching my face for any microscopic sign of bluffing, any small trace of the desperate little girl who used to beg for his basic affection. But he found absolutely nothing but smooth, polished granite. I was a completely different person now, and he finally understood that I held all the power and I would not hesitate to destroy them. 30 seconds, I announced, my voice echoing loudly off the imported Italian marble walls. Vanessa began crying loudly, begging her daddy not to abandon her. She screamed that they could figure something out, that they could hire lawyers and fight me in federal court to get the house back. But Desmond knew the absolute truth. Julian had stolen the money, and there was no legal defense in the world that could save them from the bank. I had swooped in and purchased their massive debt outright legally, making me the absolute undisputed owner of their entire world. The trap was sprung and there was absolutely no escape. 10 seconds, I said softly, taking a single deliberate step backward toward the main exit doors. Desmond let out a long, trembling breath that sounded exactly like a man finally giving up his soul. He slowly bent down his old knees, popping loudly in the silent room, and reached for the thick stack of papers on the marble floor. His hand was shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the heavy document packet. He pulled a sleek, expensive silver pen from the inside pocket of his ruined, bespoke suit jacket. He clicked the pen open, the tiny mechanical sound echoing with absolute finality. He looked at Vanessa one last time, his eyes completely dead, and then he slowly reached out to sign his name and hand his entire world over to me. Desmond gripped the sleek silver pen in his trembling hand, holding it just inches above the signature line on the thick stack of legal documents. His hand shook so violently that a tiny drop of black ink fell onto the pristine white paper. Before he could press the tip of the pen down, Vanessa let out a blood-curdling scream. She violently wrenched herself free from the grip of the security guards, who simply let her go because she was no longer a physical threat to anyone but herself. She threw herself across the short distance and collapsed heavily onto the hard Italian marble floor right at my father's feet. The loud, sickening thud of her knees hitting the stone echoed through the completely silent clinic. She grabbed Desmond's arm with both of her hands, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging desperately into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. "Daddy, no!" she shrieked, her voice completely unrecognizable. Her face was twisted into a horrific mask of pure panic and selfish terror. "You cannot let her do this to us, Daddy, please. You cannot give her the house. You have to fight her. I am a doctor. I am your pride and joy. You always said I was the best thing that ever happened to this family. You cannot just let this jealous loser take everything we have built." Desmond slowly lowered his shaking hand. He did not pull away from her immediately. Instead, he just stood there and looked down at his precious golden child, kneeling on the floor in her ruined custom silk gown. For my entire 31 years of life, I had watched this man look at Vanessa with nothing but absolute pure adoration. He had worshipped the very ground she walked on. He had excused every single cruel thing she ever did. He had financed her entire fake life and stepped on my neck just to boost her up. But right now, in this cold, empty clinic, illuminated by the harsh white spotlight, there was absolutely no adoration left in his eyes. The magical delusion had finally completely shattered. He looked at her tear-streaked face, and for the very first time in his arrogant life, he actually saw her for exactly what she was. He saw the boundless, endless greed. He saw the complete lack of empathy. He saw the spoiled, entitled monster that he and Vivica had created. Julian stole my entire retirement, Vanessa, he said. His voice was no longer booming with patriarchal authority. It was thin and hollow like a dry, fragile reed snapping in the winter wind. He looked down at her hands gripping his jacket, and then looked at the expensive designer shoes on her feet. Your husband stole every single penny I worked my entire life to save, and you stood right there and let him do it. You let him drain my accounts just to fund your expensive shoes and your designer bags and this ridiculous fake clinic. We have nothing left. Vanessa shook her head frantically, her blonde hair whipping wildly around her face. No, Daddy, I did not know. She sobbed, lying through her teeth even at the very bitter end. I had no idea what Julian was doing, I swear. Desmond let out a ragged, exhausted sigh. He did not believe her. The absolute finality of his ruin was heavier than any lie she could spin. We have nothing left, Vanessa, he repeated softly. The bank is taking the house on Monday, and we have absolutely nowhere to go. He slowly, firmly peeled her desperate, clinging fingers off his suit jacket. He pushed her hands away, letting her fall back onto her heels. He turned his back on his golden child and looked down at the documents resting on the marble floor. He took a deep, shaky breath, leaning over and pressing the silver pen to the paper. The scratching sound of the pen moving across the signature line was the loudest sound in the entire world. It was the sound of the mighty Wilson family dynasty officially signing over their entire kingdom to the daughter they had thrown away like garbage. Desmond finished signing the last page. He slowly stood back up and completely ignored my mother, who was still wailing pathetically near the melted ice sculpture. He did not look at Vanessa. He simply handed the pen back to me and took a slow, shuffling step backward, melting into the heavy, dark shadows of the room. He was defeated. He was broken. He was officially my dependent. Vanessa watched him surrender, and a fresh wave of absolute hysterical terror washed over her. She realized in that exact moment that her parents could no longer protect her. They had no money, no power, and no influence left to shield her from the brutal consequences of her own actions. Julian was sitting in the back of a federal squad car. Her clinic was gone. Her medical license was suspended. She was completely, utterly alone. She slowly turned her head and looked up at me. I was standing tall and completely calm, holding the legal deed to the house she had grown up in. The absolute power dynamic of our entire lives had permanently shifted. The golden child was kneeling on the floor, and the worthless scapegoat was holding all the keys to the kingdom. Vanessa scrambled forward on her hands and knees, dragging her expensive dress across the sticky, spilled champagne. She crawled right up to the tips of my shoes. She looked up at me, and her face completely crumpled. All the arrogance, all the smug superiority, all the cruel condescension melted away, leaving behind a pathetic, terrified shell of a woman. Nadine, please, she sobbed heavily, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. I am so sorry, Nadine. I am sorry for the slap earlier. I am sorry for everything. I was just stressed and scared. Please, you have to forgive me. You cannot leave me like this. I stared down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, no sisterly bond. She was just a bad investment that had finally gone bankrupt. I have no money. Nadine, she wailed desperately, clasping her hands together in front of her chest as if she was praying to me. The federal agents froze all of my accounts this morning. Julian locked me out of the emergency funds. I do not even have a single dollar to my name right now. You cannot throw me out on the street. Please, Nadine, I am begging you. I have absolutely nothing. I watched her cry, letting the absolute pathetic desperation of her pleas wash over me. She expected me to break. She expected my lifelong, desperate need for family approval to finally kick in and save her. She thought she could manipulate my empathy, just like she had manipulated everyone else her entire life. I slowly reached into my sleek designer purse. I did not break eye contact with her as my hand wrapped around a small rectangular object waiting patiently at the bottom of my bag. I pulled it out, holding it directly over her tear-soaked face. My fingers brushed against the smooth leather lining of my bag before finding exactly what I was looking for. I slowly withdrew my hand, keeping my fist closed for a moment to let the absolute agonizing anticipation stretch through the silent room. Vanessa stared up at me, her tear-soaked eyelashes trembling uncontrollably. She probably expected me to pull out a checkbook or the keys to a luxury condo or maybe a stack of $100 bills to ease her suffering. She was so completely conditioned to being bailed out of every single mistake she ever made. I opened my hand and revealed a single, slightly crumpled $20 bill. It looked incredibly pathetic under the bright gallery lights of the clinic. I held it between my index finger and my thumb, staring down at the woman who had spent her entire existence wearing designer brands and mocking my thrift store clothes. I remembered every single holiday where Vanessa received lavish, expensive gifts, while I was handed cheap, practical items and told to be grateful. I remembered the times I had to beg them for basic school supplies, while they planned their next luxury vacation to Europe. All of that pain, all of that endless humiliation was condensed into the small piece of currency resting in my palm. I opened my fingers and let the piece of paper go. We both watched in complete silence as the $20 bill fluttered slowly through the air. It drifted back and forth before finally landing gently on the sticky marble floor right next to Vanessa's ruined $2,000 imported leather heels. She stared down at the green paper as if it was a highly venomous snake. Her brain simply could not process what was happening. For a woman who regularly dropped thousands of dollars on a single casual lunch with her fake socialite friends, a $20 bill was a brutal, agonizing insult. It was the absolute lowest form of charity. It was exactly the amount of money you would hand to a total stranger begging on the side of the highway. "Here is $20. I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any human sympathy. "Go buy yourself a cheap blazer. You are going to need it for your job interviews." Vanessa let out a sharp gasp, clutching her chest as if I had physically stabbed her. A cheap blazer. The very words seemed to physically burn her ears. She looked up at me, her jaw trembling violently. I continued staring down at her pathetic form, making sure she understood the absolute grim reality of her new life. "Your medical license is gone, Vanessa. Your fraudulent business is being seized by the federal government. Your husband is going to prison for a very long time, and your bank accounts do not exist anymore. You are going to have to do something you have never done in your entire pampered, pathetic life. You are going to have to get a real job. You will be flipping burgers or folding cheap shirts at a discount retail store just to afford a tiny, dirty apartment. So pick up your $20 and start practicing how to ask people if they want fries with that. You will learn what it feels like to count your pennies at the grocery store just to see if you can afford a loaf of bread. You will learn what it feels like to have your feet ache after standing on them for 12 hours straight while entitled customers scream in your face. Welcome to the real world, Vanessa. It is exactly the world you and your parents forced me into 5 years ago. I survived it because I had to. But looking at you right now, crying on the floor in a puddle of spilled champagne, I highly doubt you will last a single week." Vanessa collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands and sobbing so hard that her entire body shook. It was a loud, ugly sound, but nobody in the room moved to comfort her. Desmond was still standing in the deep shadows, staring blankly at the wall like a ghost. And Vivica, my mother, the woman who had worshipped Vanessa since the day she was born, completely ignored her weeping golden child. Instead, Vivica turned her attention entirely to me. I watched the gears turning in her shallow, materialistic brain. She saw that Vanessa was a sinking ship. She saw that Desmond had surrendered his power. She realized that I was the only person left in the room who possessed the wealth and status she so desperately craved. Vivica quickly wiped her ruined mascara from her cheeks and smoothed down the front of her stained silk dress. She pasted on a completely artificial smile that made my stomach physically turn. She took a step toward me, opening her arms wide, as if we were the best of friends. "Oh, Nadine," she cooed, her voice dripping with absolute sickening fake warmth. "We are so proud of you, Nadine. We always knew you were special. We always knew you were going to do amazing things with your life. You are so strong and so brilliant, just like your mother." The sheer audacity of her lie was absolutely breathtaking. She actually tried to wipe away a fake tear of joy. She completely ignored the fact that her favorite daughter was currently having a mental breakdown on the floor right next to her feet. Vivica only cared about survival, and survival meant latching on to the person with the largest bank account. It was the most pathetic, disgusting display of opportunism I had ever witnessed in my entire life. She thought I was stupid. She thought I was still that desperate little girl who would gladly accept a tiny crumb of fake affection and forgive a lifetime of absolute torture. She reached out her hands to pull me into a tight maternal hug, hoping to seal her place in my good graces. I stepped backward so quickly that she stumbled forward and nearly lost her balance. I looked at her with an expression of pure, icy revulsion. "Do not touch me!" I commanded, my voice echoing off the high ceilings like a crack of thunder. Vivica froze, her empty arms still hanging in the air. Her fake smile slowly slid off her face, replaced by genuine fear. "You are not my mother anymore," I stated coldly. "You are not my family. As of today, you and Desmond are nothing more than my tenants. You live in my house now. I own the roof over your head, and I own the ground you walk on. Rent is due on the first of every single month. I do not care how you get the money. You can sell your jewelry, or you can join Vanessa filling out job applications at the local diner. But if you are even one single day late, I will evict you without a second thought. You will find your precious belongings sitting in garbage bags on the sidewalk, and the locks will be changed." I looked around the beautiful ruined clinic one last time, taking in the shattered crystal, the spilled drinks, and the completely destroyed family dynasty. My revenge was finally complete. I turned around and walked toward the heavy glass exit doors, letting the sharp, confident click of my heels echo loudly in the silent room. I did not look back. I stepped out into the cool, fresh night air, leaving them alone in the dark with the heavy, crushing weight of their brand new reality. The heavy glass doors closed firmly behind me, shutting out the pathetic, wailing sounds of my ruined family. The crisp December night air hit my face like a refreshing wave of absolute freedom. I stood on the pristine concrete sidewalk for a long, quiet moment, letting the freezing winter wind wipe away the stifling, suffocating atmosphere of Vanessa's shattered vanity project. Through the tinted floor-to-ceiling windows of the clinic, I could still see the blurry, pathetic outlines of my parents and my sister. They were just dark, shrinking shadows kneeling on the cold marble floor, exactly where they belonged. I took a deep breath, pulling the freezing air deep into my lungs. It tasted like absolute pure victory. The crushing weight of their constant judgment and their endless casual cruelty was completely gone. I had carried that massive toxic burden on my shoulders for 31 agonizing years, and now I was finally setting it down forever. I did not feel guilty. I did not feel any lingering shred of familial regret. I only felt a profound, overwhelming sense of hard-won peace. I pulled my designer coat tighter around my shoulders to block the biting wind and walked down the perfectly illuminated pathway. My luxury Maybach was idling quietly by the curb, its sleek black exterior gleaming like a dark mirror under the harsh yellow streetlights. Marcus, my personal driver, was waiting patiently beside the rear passenger door. He saw me approaching and immediately stood at strict attention, opening the heavy armored door with a polite, highly respectful nod. He did not ask any probing questions about the federal agents or the massive, chaotic scene that had just unfolded inside the building. He was a seasoned professional who understood the absolute priceless value of total discretion. "Good evening, boss," Marcus said quietly, offering me a warm, genuine smile that was worth infinitely more than every single fake pleasantry my mother had ever spoken to me. "Good evening, Marcus," I replied, stepping gracefully into the spacious, heated interior of the vehicle. The heavy door closed behind me, sealing me safely inside a quiet, impenetrable fortress of absolute security and immense wealth. I sank back into the soft, heated leather seats, letting my tired, tense muscles finally relax After the massive adrenaline rush of the evening, the faint, comforting smell of expensive leather and subtle vanilla filled the dark cabin. I looked out the tinted window as Marcus navigated the long, expensive luxury vehicle smoothly away from the curb and out into the bustling city traffic. The brightly lit clinic slowly disappeared into the distance, shrinking until it was nothing more than a tiny, irrelevant speck in my rearview mirror. That massive building had been Vanessa's ultimate monument to her own towering narcissistic ego. It was supposed to be the ultimate undeniable proof that she was infinitely better than everyone else in the world. Now it was just an empty hollow tomb for the Martin family dynasty. I leaned my head against the cool glass and watched the bright, colorful city lights streak past the window like shooting stars. I had survived their endless abuse. I had survived their horrific betrayal. I had survived the freezing cold, miserable nights sleeping in the back seat of my car while they drank expensive wine and laughed at my pain. They tried to bury me deep in the dirt, but they did not realize I was a resilient seed. I had grown silently in the dark, and now I was a massive towering tree that cast a permanent shadow over their entire pathetic existence. The quiet, peaceful silence of the car was suddenly broken by the soft, vibrating hum of my cell phone. I reached into my purse and pulled out the device. The bright screen illuminated the dark cabin, showing a secure incoming call from Sarah, my chief operating officer. She was the brilliant, ruthless corporate strategist who had helped me silently execute this massive hostile takeover over the past 2 years. I pressed the answer button and brought the phone to my ear. Boss Sarah said, her voice buzzing with highly contained professional excitement. The final acquisition is completely verified. The federal authorities just finished processing the immediate total asset seizure. Julian Martin's entire estate is officially completely liquidated. We own every single remaining share of his holding companies, and the deed to your parents' massive suburban estate is completely locked in our corporate vault. The bank confirmed the massive transfer exactly 5 minutes ago. There is absolutely nothing left for them to salvage anywhere. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not the cold, terrifying smirk I had given my mother inside the clinic. It was a real bright smile of pure, absolute satisfaction. The long, agonizing war was finally permanently over. "You did incredible work tonight, Sarah," I said, my voice soft but filled with immense, genuine gratitude. "Make sure you take the rest of the entire week off. You have earned a massive financial bonus for pulling off this logistical nightmare on such incredibly short notice." "Thank you, boss," Sarah replied happily. "What do you want us to do with the physical clinic property? It is sitting on a prime piece of high-value commercial real estate right in the middle of the luxury district. We could easily flip it to a massive private medical conglomerate by the end of the fiscal quarter and triple our initial investment." I reached forward and opened the sleek hidden compartment of the car's luxury minibar. I pulled out a chilled crystal flute and a small bottle of incredibly expensive imported vintage champagne. I popped the cork, letting the soft fizzing sound echo in the quiet cabin. I poured the bubbling golden liquid into the glass, watching the tiny, sparkling bubbles rise to the surface. It was the exact same expensive brand of champagne that Julian had spilled all over the marble floor when he tried to run like a pathetic coward. I took a slow, appreciative sip, letting the crisp, sweet taste wash over my tongue. "Excellent," I said, staring at the beautiful amber liquid. "But we are not selling the property, Sarah. I have a much better, more poetic plan for that building. Send a massive commercial cleaning crew to the clinic tomorrow morning," I instructed, my voice ringing with absolute firm authority. "I want every single trace of Vanessa Martin completely scrubbed from the premises before noon. Tear down her massive, tacky gold vanity signs. Throw away her expensive, ridiculous velvet furniture. Rip out that absurd imported marble registration desk and toss it in the nearest city landfill. We are completely gutting the entire luxurious interior. We are turning that massive $5 million vanity project into a totally free community health center. I want to hire the absolute best pediatricians and general practitioners in the entire city. I want it fully funded and fully staffed by next month. Vanessa wanted to use that building to cater exclusively to the ultra-wealthy elite and mock the poor. We are going to use her destroyed empire to treat the exact same low-income struggling families she spent her entire pathetic life looking down on. Make it happen, Sarah. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the empty leather seat beside me. I took another long, slow sip of my champagne and looked out at the beautiful glowing skyline of the city I now essentially owned. My family had spent my entire life trying to make me feel incredibly small. They tried to convince me that I was a broken, worthless disappointment who would never amount to anything important. But as I sat in the back of my Maybach drinking vintage champagne and planning a massive philanthropic empire, I realized they had actually given me the greatest gift in the world. Their endless cruelty had forged me into absolute unbreakable steel. I was no longer the tragic, forgotten scapegoat of the Wilson family. I was Nadine, and I was completely, absolutely free. 6 months had passed since that freezing December night, when I walked out of the clinic and permanently closed the door on my old life. I sat in the sprawling living room of my downtown penthouse, letting the bright morning sunlight warm my skin. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a completely unobstructed view of the city skyline that I now practically owned. I held a cup of dark black coffee in my hands, letting the steam rise into the quiet, peaceful air of my home. My laptop rested on the sleek glass coffee table in front of me, softly playing the morning news broadcast. The world had kept spinning, but the fundamental power dynamic of my entire universe had completely shifted. I was no longer the forgotten scapegoat hiding in the shadows. I was the absolute, undisputed architect of my own destiny. The newscaster was speaking in that serious, measured tone they always used for high-profile white-collar crime. A picture of Julian flashed on the screen, looking pale and terrified in a drab gray suit that was a far cry from his usual custom-tailored Italian silk. He had finally faced the federal judge yesterday afternoon, after months of desperate, pathetic legal maneuvering. The verdict was absolutely devastating, but completely deserved. Julian Martin, the former golden boy of the city's medical elite, was officially sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison for massive wire fraud, grand larceny, and criminal conspiracy. He had tried to cry and beg the judge for mercy, just like he always did when things got difficult. But the mountain of evidence my team provided was entirely bulletproof. There was no leniency, and there was absolutely no possibility of early parole. He was going to spend the next decade and a half locked in a tiny concrete cell, surrounded by people who did not care about his expensive taste in imported watches or his fake prestigious lineage. His arrogant smirks and cruel condescension had been permanently erased by the harsh, brutal reality of the federal penal system. The broadcast quickly shifted to the collateral damage of his crimes, highlighting the permanent revocation of Vanessa's medical license. I took a slow sip of my coffee, picturing my sister exactly where she was right now. My private investigators had given me a highly detailed update just yesterday. The golden child of the Wilson family was no longer living in a sprawling mansion or throwing lavish catered parties for fake socialite friends. She was currently renting a tiny, dingy room in a rundown apartment complex on the far edge of the city. Her massive closet of designer clothes and imported leather shoes had been completely seized and sold at public auction to help pay back the millions of dollars she owed to her defrauded patients. Now she took a crowded, smelly public bus every single morning to work at a local dyeing shopping mall. She was employed at a budget cosmetic counter wearing a cheap, scratchy polyester uniform blazer and forcefully smiling at impatient, rude customers who complained about the price of cheap lipstick. She spent her exhausted days matching foundation shades for obnoxious teenagers and wiping down dirty glass display cases with a rag. It was a brutal, humiliating fall from her absolute peak of arrogance. The woman who used to mock my thrift store clothes was now completely, entirely dependent on minimum wage and whatever meager tips she could scrounge up just to afford her basic groceries. And then there were my parents, Desmond and Vivica, the cruel, arrogant architects of my lifelong misery, were currently living the exact quiet, terrified existence I had promised them. They still resided in the massive suburban house they had raised me in, but it was no longer their safe, untouchable castle. It was my legally owned property, and they were nothing more than my very reluctant, highly stressed tenants. Sarah, my brilliant chief operating officer, handled their property management account personally. Every single month on the exact first day of the month, my parents eagerly transferred their rent payment with absolute terrified precision. They knew that if they were even one single minute late, I would instruct the legal team to begin immediate ruthless eviction proceedings. They had completely withdrawn from their wealthy social circles, far too embarrassed to show their faces at the country club or attend high society charity dinners. They spent their days sitting in a massive empty house completely stripped of their power, their money, and their influence, waiting nervously for the next rent cycle to begin. They had traded their arrogant superiority for absolute total submission. Desmond no longer boomed with patriarchal authority, and Vivica no longer spun her toxic webs of manipulation. They were just two tired old people living in constant fear of the daughter they had thrown away like garbage. My thoughts drifted to the old clinic building. Just last week, Sarah had sent me pictures of the grand opening. The tacky gold vanity signs and the absurd imported marble had been completely ripped out and destroyed. In their place stood a bright, clean, welcoming community health center that provided totally free medical care to low-income families. The very people Vanessa and Julian had built their fraudulent empire to avoid were now walking through those doors and receiving top-tier treatment from the absolute best doctors in the city. I had taken the physical manifestation of their boundless greed and transformed it into a beacon of genuine human compassion. It was the ultimate poetic justice. I reached forward and slowly closed my laptop, shutting off the news broadcast and letting the sprawling penthouse fall into complete luxurious silence. I stood up and walked over to the massive glass window, looking down at the tiny cars and tiny people moving through the busy city streets far below me. I remembered the harsh, stinging pain of my mother's hand striking my face that day in the clinic. I remembered the decades of being told I was a worthless failure who would never amount to anything important. I took a deep breath, feeling the absolute immense power radiating through my entire body. They thought a slap would put me in my place. They were right. It put me on a throne, and it put them on the street. Sometimes the best way to fix a broken family tree is to chop it down and buy the forest. I turned away from the window and walked into the bright, promising future I had built entirely on my own. The greatest lesson here is that your worth is never defined by people who try to tear you down. Sometimes the family you are born into is just a heavy anchor meant to keep you trapped. You do not owe loyalty to toxic people just because they share your blood. True strength comes from walking away and building your own kingdom from the ashes of their disrespect. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to find your own success? Share your journey in the comments below and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power.